Hello and welcome to the latest instalment of The Conquered and the Proud, and this time we'll be looking at the reigns of Augustus's family. Augustus the cat chipping in as usual on cue. So we'll be looking at the Julio-Claudians, the modern name for them. Tiberius, Gaius or Caligula, Claudius and Nero. So we're very much looking at the rule of emperors, how the system that Augustus did so much to shape and effectively created, how that actually played out in practice in the following decades. So let's start with a quote from Strabo, the Greek geographer, writing during the reign of Tiberius. So very much contemporary comment on this, and obviously one that fitted with the official attitude of the regime. He said this: "It is difficult to control and administer an empire as large as Rome's other than by entrusting it to one man as to a father. And indeed, the Romans and their allies have never enjoyed such an abundance of peace and prosperity as that which Augustus Caesar provided from the time when he first assumed absolute power, and which his son and successor, Tiberius, is now providing. Tiberius has made Augustus the model of his administration and ordinances, as have his children, Germanicus and Drusus, who are helping their father." So that's a view from very early on in Tiberius's reign, giving a very positive view. You'll find even 200 years later, Cassius Dio, a Greek from Bithynia, a senator and a Roman as well, somebody who had a very distinguished career in the politics of the empire. He talked about, referring to Julius Caesar, the realization that how much easier it is to find one good man to rule rather than hundreds of them. Which is fine in theory, as long as you have a good system of obviously selecting that man. So we are looking at one-man rule, monarchy, at this principle. The Julio-Claudians is an expression that's a modern invention, as are so many of the terms we apply to ancient history. It's a very important period, it's a very famous period, in part because of the dramatic portrayal of it in I, Claudius and the like, and the way that Caligula and Nero feature in biblical epics. Quo Vadis, that sort of thing, the robe, Demetrius the gladiator, all those sorts of things. So Nero is someone who horrifies us, so does Caligula, particularly as the way they've been portrayed, although those portrayals do draw upon the ancient sources. But those sources do present a problem. The first is simple coverage. This is, with the 1st century BC, the 1st century AD, we would see as the sort of the central period of Roman history where we have most information and we have our best chance of understanding how the Roman system worked, how Roman society worked. Even so, at one aspect of it, we deal with lots of problems of information. So for the Julio-Claudians, we rely very, very heavily on the author Tacitus, a senator writing in the early 2nd century AD, son-in-law of Agricola, the governor of Britain, someone who'd had his career starting off under Domitian, under the Flavians, and then continued through under Nerva, Trajan and Hadrian. Tacitus claimed that he was going to write sine ira et studio, without anger, without, I suppose, prejudice or something like that is the best translation of that. Now, a lot of ancient historians proclaim that they're going to write independently, they're going to just tell you the facts and analyse them, and they're going to be unbiased and all this sort of thing. Plenty of modern historians do the same and don't live up to those pledges terribly well. Tacitus clearly has strong opinions, and he is deeply critical. There is a message, in a sense, of the corruption of power, that emperors might start out with good intentions or might be moderated in their behaviour by good influences, but that gradually they come under the influence of worse and worse characters and their own baser instincts start to emerge and they become more and more tyrannical. So you have that power corrupts idea that permeates it. You also have, whilst he does portray the various senators who opposed or perceived to oppose, and particularly those who end up having to commit suicide or being executed during these reigns, there is also an element where he's thinking from his own perspective, well, if they'd just kept their heads down, kept their thoughts to themselves, they could still be decent Romans, even under bad emperors, and their personal behaviour could be without blemish. And that perhaps is a more useful thing for the empire and for the Republic as a whole than making a big show of opposition and just ending up dead. So you have that. Tacitus was a great cynic. He's the man who comes out with these very apt expression, the idea that it's natural to hate people you've wronged because you assume that they're going to want to do to you what you've just done to them. You're thinking on your own terms, even whether that's not true. Lots of these others, obviously, who will guard the guards, all these sorts of things, all these expressions that develop from this first century period, most of them go back to Tacitus. Tacitus is supplemented by Suetonius, who wrote lives of the first 12 Caesars. So it's not the first 12 emperors, because he starts with Julius Caesar. He was an official in the imperial administration under Hadrian, but gets sacked. Seems to be some sort of scandal involving Sabina, Hadrian's wife, and probably not an affair or anything like that, but some sense that she is being indiscreet or behaving in a way that Hadrian does not want for the sort of Rome's first lady, in a sense, if you can use that expression, that she just isn't very good at being an empress. And it's noticeable that in his early lives, the information he has is significantly better, and we'll come across that again. We'll come back to it when we look at Claudius. Whereas in the later lives, they tend to be shorter, and there's less behind-the-scenes private family records, letters, that sort of thing. Now, Suetonius survives in its entirety. Tacitus' annals do not, so they should have covered from AD 14 through to 68. Instead, we have sections which cover parts of Tiberius's reign, significant parts, but nevertheless there are big gaps as well. Nothing for Caligula's reign, only part of the account of Claudius's reign, and then most of Nero. So that's just the chance of which manuscripts have survived through the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. Much of Tacitus was rediscovered in the early modern period, and it did have an influence on political ideas, concepts of what you expected from a government, and more broadly, how people should view the world. So it had a lot of influence on German nationalism, on the rise of Lutheranism, and other concepts of also, what should a prince be? What government should you have? Should there be an overwhelming empire? And if so, how do you relate to that? So Tacitus has had a huge, huge influence, and he is certainly one of the most stylistically impressive Roman authors, and far less simple. Tacitian prose is nowhere near as simple as, say, Caesar's commentaries, but then he wasn't writing commentaries. On the other hand, there are some interesting confirmations that basically his account is reasonably reliable. So, for instance, we have the Senatus Consultum about Calpurnius Piso. We'll talk about him a little bit later today, and we have in some of the other talks before this. Tacitus gives a long account of the senatorial debate and their decision. An inscription from Spain, discovered in the 90s, listed the formal decree that the Senate announced as a result, and pretty much it's very close. Tacitus is not word for word by any means, but he basically covers all the same points. Similarly, he gives we have support for a speech he attributes to Claudius when Claudius was admitting a new contingent of senators, many of them from Gaul, and not just Transalpine Gaul into the south, but what had been Gallia Comata in Caesar's day, long-haired Gaul. And again, an inscription with part of this speech has been discovered at Lugdunum, and again, it's not exact, but it's pretty close. So where we do have chances for confirmation, Tacitus actually comes out very well. So even though you suspect that this is a very carefully constructed, Tacitus was famous as the greatest orator of his day, the sort of new Cicero, that this is a very partial, very deliberate, very carefully managed description and presentation of the period. Nevertheless, he's actually pretty faithful to not just the big facts, but many of the small ones as well. Though again, obviously, he is selective, and the way he presents things does reflect his own attitudes and his own interpretation. So we do have a problem. There are parts of this period where it's very hard to know precisely what's going on. Suetonius wasn't writing history, he was writing biography, and he was drawn to the lurid, to the gossip. And there are things where he reports things that he clearly doesn't really believe, but it's a good story, so he might as well put it in anyway. And this makes understanding Caligula particularly difficult, because we are largely reliant on Suetonius, and then Dio from writing in the 3rd century AD, but Dio mostly survives in the forms of various epitomes, where a later author, a Byzantine author, has summarized what's in Dio and reduced it. And again, that means that not only was Dio a little bit inclined towards the lurid in the first place, but those creating the sort of the short, pithy version are especially drawn to that. So for some periods, that's pretty much all you get. Where he survives in full, as he does for some of Claudius and Nero's reign, it's decent, but again, it reflects the perspective of somebody writing 2 centuries after Augustus, when the rule of the Principate is entirely normal. It's hard to imagine anything else. Tacitus has a strong nostalgia for the Republic when the state was guided by the Senate, by men of his own class. And this is something that influences all the ancient sources for this period. Essentially, they are either written by or for senators or both. They're very much products of the elite for the elite, because this is an era where you can only have a book if somebody copies out the manuscript letter by letter. There's no printing press, there's nothing like that, there's no way of mass producing any form of manuscript. So owning books tends to be something, a luxury that only the rich can enjoy. Now, emperors from Augustus onwards continue to set up public libraries in Rome. You get similar things on a smaller scale in some provincial cities. And some works you can tell, and one suspects this is true of Caesar's commentaries back in the 1st century BC, they are also designed to be read out. And you can sense there's a rhythm to the way it works that suits itself very well to that. That's partly because the people writing them have that oratorical training as well, so it's the way they think and use words. But there's that element where you can well imagine somebody can afford to get the book, so they have a dinner party and they have readings as part of it. And this is something we hear about in aristocratic culture, but also lower down the scale. So this extends to the... Again, scholars will get all very twitchy if you start talking about a middle class in Roman society, but those in the middle, those with some prosperity, some status, levels of literacy, some levels of comfort, that they're not working full-time, every day, and can have these leisured pursuits and also aspire to the dignity of the senators and the elite. So these are equestrians and people who don't get the equestrian status, but census level, but still have significant property, who tend on the whole to have similar views, or at least aspire, many of them, and are willing to, this is the literature they're getting, given to them in the same way that whatever our personal tastes, we can only watch, say, the TV shows or the films that people decide to make, and those are the people who can get the money, get organised, and actually make the thing. And obviously they may have ideas, agendas that are idiosyncratic, peculiar to that particular group, and not necessarily representative of the wider population, but we'll watch them anyway because it's either that or watch nothing. And everyone is, in any age, can listen to something or can watch something, whether it's a play, whether it's on screen, whether it's on the page. They can still enjoy it and find satisfaction in it. They don't have to agree with it. So, don't think in simplistic terms that everybody's just buying the line of a particular author. But this audience, this aristocratic, this audience of the elite, means that emperors tend to be judged very much on their behaviour towards this same group and its most prominent members, which tend to be the Senate and the most prominent senators, the ones who draw attention. It's the old cliche for Greek tyrants, the advice that you chop off the heads of the tallest flowers. The people who stand out are the ones who tend to draw attention, and often in more difficult, dangerous circumstances, bad things happen to them. So that's the theme. There is this strong idea that every emperor is judged on how he treats the Senate. Now, obviously, this was a big deal. Augustus took great care to this. We've touched on this a little bit, but it's worth stopping for a few quotes. Suetonius, for instance, talks about Augustus' speeches in the House would often be interrupted by such remarks as, "I don't understand you," or "I dispute your point if I got a chance." And it happened more than once that, exasperated by recriminations which lowered the tone of the debates, he left the House in angry haste and was followed by shouts of, "You ought to let senators say exactly what they think about matters of public importance." And then a little, slightly before that, in fact, in the manuscript, Augustus always felt horrified and insulted when called my lord, Dominus. Once, when he was watching a comedy, one of the players spoke the line, "O just and generous Lord," whereupon the entire audience rose to their feet and applauded, as if the phrase referred to Augustus. A look and a gesture soon quelled this unsuitable flattery, and the next day he issued an edict of stern reprimand. Hopefully something that we've emphasised throughout the talks on Augustus is how he walked this tightrope. He was a military dictator. His power rested on the fact that he was the last man standing at the end of the civil wars and that he controlled the military. So it comes back to, the comment about Hadrian of the philosopher who's corrected by him and said, well, why didn't you complain? You don't argue with a man who controls 30 legions. That is the basic truth underlying the Principate, the rule of one man, this name we have for this system. But Augustus had taken great care to veil his power as much as possible, hence the tribunicium potestas. He parades the powers of the tribunate that he's been awarded, rather than his maius imperium proconsulare, his power, his authority greater than that of any proconsul. And the fact that most of the empire and all the significant military provinces are controlled by him and governed by his legati, by his representatives, rather than by senators simply given the job because they're senators. So you have this great emphasis on behaviour, that Augustus attends meetings of the Senate, tries to encourage free debate, although it doesn't always work that well, tries to restrain his anger, the story of him reciting the alphabet quietly in his head before he answers just to calm himself down a bit. And that's changed from the very brutal figure he cut when he rose to power, his enthusiasm for executions. But this is a man who would walk through the streets of Rome to meetings of the Senate, to dine with other senators, who would receive other senators in his house, along with all the guests, particularly in the morning, but at other times of day, who very much tried to present himself as primus inter pares, first among equals. So the Augustan regime succeeds to a great extent because it makes the rule of one man and the rule of a military dictator, not with that title, but nevertheless that's effectively what he is. He rules because he controls the army, because he monopolizes military force. Then it softens all of that. It makes it seem that in fact he's chosen by the people to do this, to lead Rome, because he is the best man. Hence the sentiment you have expressed by Strabo that we read earlier, where it's very clear the Republican system couldn't cope. You need one man in charge to make all the decisions. That's the only way you'll get peace and stability. And of course, the record of the late Republic argues in favour of this interpretation. But it was a problem, and obviously, because he's not a king, because he's not dictator, there isn't a position of princeps. Augustus has had all these powers voted to him as an individual. He's got the maius imperium, he's got the tribunicium potestas, he's dating his reign in a sense on the years of the tribunician power. But there isn't a job description where you say you are emperor, you are princeps, and you get all these powers, this is what you do, you control this of the empire. Because it's all been done so tactfully and trying to persuade Romans that actually this is still just a normal natural republic, the Commonwealth functioning very well for the good of all, and that Augustus is our most distinguished man, our best leader, therefore we've chosen him to lead us, and he does so brilliantly. But there is always that question of what will happen afterwards. There isn't talk of a formal heir as such, and yet everybody clearly, even at the time, is thinking in those terms. And you have the successive favouring of Marcellus, Agrippa, Gaius and Lucius, and then subsequently you've got, obviously, as we've seen, though we've only covered it briefly, and we may come back to looking at the status position of women in the late Republic and then in the imperial family at some point in the future when I get around to it. But things hadn't gone terribly well, so Augustus came to the conclusions that the elder and younger Julia had both been indulging in every sort of vice, and banished them. When Gaius then died in Lycia, and Lucius 18 months later at Massilia, Augustus publicly adopted his remaining grandchild, Agrippa Posthumus, and at the same time his stepson Tiberius. A special bill to legalise this act was passed in the Forum, yet he soon disinherited Posthumus, whose behaviour had lately become vulgar and brutal. So there was, of course, the problem, members of the imperial family keep on dying. He ends up with Tiberius. Now, what has become the system is to start to award some of his powers at a lesser level or for a shorter period to Agrippa had them before the grandsons, and then to Tiberius. So before Augustus dies, Tiberius gets Tribunicium Potestas and Maius Imperium Proconsularia, the latter with a time limit, at least at first. But he becomes more and more directly involved. The Council of the Princeps, this group of senators that up until the last year or so of Augustus' life had been drawn at random from the entire Senate, and they were there as an advisory council, a sounding board for ideas, all this sort of thing. In the last year, with Tiberius as part of this council, the men are then selected. So they're very careful who is there. Now, obviously that means they can control it, but it does mean they are shutting out some opinions that they might otherwise have had. Now, Augustus died in AD 14. Again, we haven't got time. Maybe one day we'll look at all the, the rumours of murders and the I Claudius stuff in detail. The probability is he's an old man, that he died of natural causes. He's succeeded by Tiberius, Livia's son from her earlier marriage. Tiberius is now 56. Postumus is disposed of. The sources, he's been exiled to an island, and the sources vary as to who actually gives the order, but it comes back to the supposed comment, you can have too many Caesars, with the disposal of Caesarion, people like that. Even ones that aren't important, that aren't really politically significant, aren't viable alternatives, nevertheless are potentially a threat. But it reflects that the mood that will permeate the accounts of Tiberius' reign, of this sort of cruelty beneath it all that gradually becomes less and less restrained. Now the Senate meets. Augustus's sort of last letter to them, his intentions and the recommendation of Tiberius are read out. The Senate offers Augustus's position to Tiberius. Tiberius feigns reluctance. And probably this is just trying not to seem too eager, trying not to seem too greedy for power. Bear in mind, though, Tiberius has had this period of self-imposed exile, retirement, where he's been on roads. He'd given up. Tiberius has slogged all the way through his life. He's had to work very hard doing the dirty jobs that Augustus needed done. He's campaigned for a lot of his life. He's been forced to marry Julia. That was a marriage that clearly didn't work, soured for everybody concerned, ended up with her exile. His brother's dead, lots of it. You can see this as a sinister figure manoeuvring his way through and climbing to the top, or being lifted to the top by his mother Livia, if you go full on Robert Graves. But you can also see this as someone who's working hard in a sense, the family business, and as a distinguished member of a very well-established senatorial house, or two aristocratic houses, really, both his mother's side and his father's side. These are important lines within the Roman aristocracy. And he's the new head of the household, the head of the clan, as it were. So it might just be, there's an element where he may just have been tired and thought, oh, do I really want to do this? But more probably this is trying to be Augustus, and, Augustus often turned down honours that were voted to him, or, appeared to be reluctant, oh, I don't really want to do this, but okay, if it's for the good of the state and you really want me to, okay, I will. Tiberius doesn't have Augustus's charm and misplays it. So as soon as he says, oh, well, I'm not sure I can really do all of this, it's such a great burden, then somebody pipes up and says, okay, let us know what you'd like to do and we can give you that. At which point he backtracks very quickly and says, well, no, it's fine. I'm just, I didn't want to be too forward, but I can do the job. I better take it as a whole. It is hard to see how they could have split it. He does have Germanicus and as adopted son, that's his nephew, son of his brother Drusus, who died on campaign, and Drusus, his own son. Drusus is still a little bit younger. Germanicus has already exercised field command in the Rhineland and elsewhere, and is there at the time, as is Drusus out with the provinces. But Germanicus is the more experienced, perhaps the more able of the two, but certainly the more experienced of the two. Germanicus is very, very popular. Now, one of the big dramatic sort of moments in the early part of Tacitus, the Annals, are the mutinies that occurred in the legions on the Rhine. There are about 8 of them at this time, because obviously you've had the big disaster in Germany in AD 9 with Varus and his 3 legions wiped out, the loss of the province up to the Elbe. And you've got a mix of things. There's the uncertainty. When Augustus dies, they don't know what's going to happen next. And there are men who are overdue for discharge, who've been kept with the colours because this is an emergency, and are fed up and want to go. But also that sense, well, we've been Augustus's legions, we've sworn an oath to him. And that has been the big change of the Principate. The legions and soldiers swear yes to the Senate and people of Rome, but first and foremost to the Princeps. What's going to happen? Will there be another emperor? Will he want us? Will he treat us well? We're fed up with war anyway. Panic, nervousness turns into this mutiny. At one point, Germanicus is off at the throne, very carefully turns that down. There have been problems. There's been this worry because this is a major change. Augustus has been there for more than 4 decades. Very few adults can remember much of what happened before. And you're used to Augustus making things work, bringing that Augustan peace within the empire, not necessarily on the frontiers, because there's a lot of war there. Having somebody else, even as distinguished a man as Tiberius, who's actually done a lot of the hard work for making all this happen, that's strange. Some people know him, others don't. But he doesn't yet have the grandeur, all the associations of Augustus. But there is, particularly in the Tacitan account and elsewhere, Tiberius is suspicious of Germanicus, partly because of his talent, partly because he's popular, and that's something that Tiberius never manages to do. He just doesn't have that knack. He isn't one of those likeable people. He's very capable, he's very smart, he doesn't express himself clearly, he has this tendency to strike just the wrong note in a situation. We've talked about this a little bit in the video on the relationship between Augustus and Tiberius. Germanicus gets sent to Syria in AD 17, so Tiberius basically winds down the wars beyond the Rhine, feels that they've achieved enough vengeance, they've proven that Rome is strong, that the Germans aren't going to be coming into the Rhineland or Gaul anytime soon because the Roman army will stop them. But also Tacitus talks interestingly about the shortage of animals from the Gallic provinces. The Gallic provinces just saying, look, we're exhausted, we haven't got the resources to support this war effort anymore, we simply can't give you what you need. And Tiberius, he's an experienced military commander. Now, Augustus left advice to him to keep the empire within its limits, within its boundaries. Again, you can argue about the translation, and we'll look at that far more when we do separate videos on the whole grand strategy question. But this is largely what Tiberius does. The expansion of the Augustan age, it's already been slowing down, and the Pannonian rebellion in AD 6 and then the big rebellion in Germany in AD 9 have sort of been signs of maybe overstretch. You've gone too fast, too far, you need to consolidate. Tiberius's reign is primarily one of consolidation, and there is never again a repeat of the rapid expansion and large-scale expansion under Augustus. Nothing on that scale ever occurs again. There are periodic, the invasion of Britain under Claudius, Dacia under Trajan, this sort of thing, but nothing like the Augustan scale in terms of scale and duration of expansion. That's really finished. Germanicus goes off to Syria. He's given, again, the same sort of wider regional command that Tiberius, Drusus, Agrippa and others have enjoyed for Augustus. So this is, in a sense, maintaining the Augustus system. There are problems in the east in terms of keeping the provinces settled and running efficiently, but also, there's always that question of what's the situation with Parthia? Do we need some active diplomacy there? So this is Tiberius doing things in the way that Augustus had done, by using family members as your agents to go out, because Augustus did this more and more as he got older. Tiberius is already late middle age when he succeeds. 56, by Roman standards, bear in mind that a consul under the Republic had to be 42 to stand for the office. So most consuls, most provincial governors are men in their 40s. Occasionally people will get a second command in their 50s, but somebody like Pompey, who's pushing 60, the time of the Civil War, Aemilius Paulus in the Third Macedonian War, similar age. Those are the exceptions. The Romans don't seem to have gone on in active public life as old as many Greeks and Macedonians appear to have done. Why that is, we can talk about another day, because I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but there are some intriguing possibilities. And Tiberius does seem to have been particularly strained, particularly worn out. However, Germanicus will die mysteriously in Syria in 19 BC, and this is where Calpurnius Piso gets involved. He had been legatus of Syria. Germanicus had dismissed him. When Germanicus dies, he comes back into the province, starts raising troops. We've talked about this elsewhere. It's all about the... effectively, he seems to be presented as fomenting another civil war. However, there are rumours circulating that he has murdered Germanicus, he and his wife Plancina, and of course this is developed in a big way in I, Claudius and in the television version of it, and that Livia may have encouraged them, even if Tiberius hasn't, because Germanicus was a dangerous rival, he was just too popular. And of course the I, Claudius thing goes on further with the infant Caligula, who's actually done most of the deed of scaring his father to death and arranging for his poisoning and all this sort of thing. Again, who knows? It's possible that there was foul play. It's possible that there was simply mischarge. This is the ancient world. People do die suddenly. And whether, if there was foul play, Plancina and Calpurnius Piso obviously seem very likely suspects. They didn't get on with Germanicus and his wife. However, whether or not they were acting independently or as agents of Livia Tiberius, again, we will never know. But Calpurnius Piso is arrested, is tried by the Senate, commits suicide. His family is protected as part of this. So you have, as I mentioned already, we've got the Senatus Consultum Ultimum with the text of the decree about this that does very much confirm the Tacitian account. There are minor details, but they tend to be more of emphasis and interpretation rather than the basic events, and the closeness is pretty striking. So soon after that, within a few years, Tiberius' own son Drusus dies. Again, there will be rumours of assassination of poisoning, perhaps involving one of the two Praetorian prefects at this point, a chap called Sejanus, and he becomes Tiberius's most trusted friend and assistant. Now, it's helped that he's saved Tiberius's life when they were in a cavern and the roof collapsed, and Sejanus sort of, did the Atlas thing, got over the emperor and protected him. Sejanus is an equestrian. The commanders of the Praetorian Guard have always been equestrians because you don't want a senator commanding the troops that are the most, the strongest military force in or near Rome. Under Tiberius and Sejanus's command, instead of having just 3 cohorts out of the 9 Praetorian cohorts in Rome at any one time, they all move to Rome. You have the Castra Praetoria that begins to be constructed, the development of a permanent base for the entire guard there in Rome. So that dramatically increases the number of troops at the emperor's immediate disposal or the immediate disposal of their commander, if depending on who they choose to obey. From 26 AD, so that's 12 years after he's come to the throne, Tiberius moves away from the capital. He's already spent more and more time outside Rome, even in the earlier years. And unlike Augustus did this but went to the provinces. So when he was outside of Rome, he was generally outside of Italy for most of the time. There were only relatively short periods where he's in Italy and not very near to Rome, if not in it himself. Tiberius clearly wearies of the day-to-day grind of being an emperor. Augustus, there are stories that he always had his official garb of office, a proper toga and everything, ready to put on when somebody came, that he would always listen to petitions. He would listen to people petitioning him as he walked through the street. As the emperor, you are the person with ultimate authority to do just about anything and to rule on just about any case. So people want you to do things. They want things from you. And an awful lot of your job, in a sense like that of a provincial governor, but in your case it covers the whole empire plus the Italian population, the citizen population, is to sort out disputes, sort out problems. If there are issues, if people are saying, look, we really need this, can you help us? Or there's a dispute over who owns this land, who should inherit here, how this magistracies in this city should work, this person sees power illegally, or he's holding on to it, or he's corrupt, or whatever it might be. In the end, you come to the emperor. It's the basic principle. You can have it from the New Testament, where when Paul is arrested in Jerusalem, taken to Caesarea, goes before the governor, he has appealed, because he's a Roman citizen, to the emperor to hear his case. So that then means once you've done that, the ball starts rolling. It's probably going to take a very long time to do this, especially if you're somebody like that who's not desperately important in the wider sweep of things. But it comes back to, we talked about the Strabo's account of this, representative from a fishing village on a Greek island, getting on board ship to go and see Augustus at Corinth, because he believes that in the end he'll get a hearing and there will be some reasonable chance of a response, favourable or not, you're going to get a ruling. So being emperor requires an awful lot of sitting around listening to people droning on about their problems. And then you have to think about that and say, okay, this is what we're going to do about it. This is how we'll solve this. That's hard slog, and it's pretty dull. And Tiberius seems to lack enthusiasm for this. So he retires first to Italy and then eventually to the island of Capri. A small island, lives on a luxury villa, and access to him becomes very, very difficult. So from his point of view, this is good. He's not being pestered by all this trivial stuff. But it does mean that that trivial stuff still has to be resolved in some way or other. Someone has to listen to this trivial stuff and decide what's going to happen. He's 68 by this time, so by Roman standards he's particularly old to be this active. Augustus had kept going even in these later years. Tiberius just can't be bothered. And the fact that he is such an awkward individual, Augustus took pleasure from company, from dining, from talking to other senators. Tiberius struggles with that and becomes more and more suspicious. So you have all these rumours of this debauched lifestyle. He never returns to Rome, although he reigns until 37. So for another 11 years, he's 79 when he dies. So he lives a very long life, but he's lost interest and he's trying to govern the empire at a distance, and he doesn't want to be involved. He's not doing the Augustan thing, which is softening the rule of one man, of an emperor, by being very affable, by making sure that you presented yourself as one senator amongst many, just the most distinguished of them. Tiberius just cannot be bothered to do that. He doesn't have the patience, which does affect how the Senate see him, and therefore how he is remembered and presented in the sources. There's an increasing number of treason trials that develop in this time. Maestas is the Latin word from which we get our word majesty, and it's accused of an offence against the maestas of the emperor of the res publica. It's an old idea. It's been around for a while, but it develops under the emperors, particularly from Tiberius onwards. It's a little bit like you get the charges made against sports stars and this sort of thing, where they're bringing the game into disrepute. It's quite a vague thing. So all sorts of things, in time, casting the horoscope of the emperor could be seen as treason. Voicing negative opinions can be seen. Sometimes you get away with it, sometimes you don't. And the way the system works is that the people who accuse an individual, if the case is proven, if that person's found guilty, then when their property or a substantial part of it is confiscated by the state, the accuser gets a share of it. So there's a big incentive for people to do that, apart from the fact that if you realise those in charge want this, then it's a good way of gaining favour, which might help your own career. So Sejanus becomes heavily associated with this because, again, he controls access to the emperor. You're not going to get to Capri, let alone into the presence of the emperor, unless Sejanus allows you. And that was already true to some extent when he was in Italy. But once he's physically on an island, you cannot just walk there and wait and rely on the fact that I am a member of a distinguished family, I'm an old friend of the emperor, therefore I'm sure he'll see me at some point. Now you have to get permission to go in a boat there, because otherwise, if you're sailing off to threaten the emperor on his island, are you plotting? Are you? It's not a wise move to make. So you have the exile of Agrippina, the widow of Germanicus, Germanicus's children, Drusus and Nero. Caligula, Gaius, the youngest, ends up at Capri with Tiberius. Sejanus appears to get marked out as heir. So you have, again, that same process. So in 31, he holds the consulship jointly with Tiberius. It's named second. Again, this was another marker that this was a person who was being favoured, and it's the first stage, really. Everybody knew he was really close to the emperor. Everybody knows he controls access to the emperor. They get the emperor's decisions, but only at second hand, as what Sejanus tells them. Therefore, They don't know whether he's the one who's making these decisions for his convenience, or it's actually come from Tiberius. He's voted proconsular imperium, so the maius imperium. So again, we're getting to this point. Now bear in mind, this is a man who is an equestrian, who's only been just admitted into the Senate as part of all of this. So the idea has been you put an equestrian in charge of your guard because they can't have ambitions to become an emperor. Well, Sejanus appears to be demonstrating the falsehood of that assumption. So it's just as Tiberius. He's following the same route that Tiberius, but also some of the heirs that didn't live long enough, potential heirs for Augustus. He's then, however, accused of treason by Antonia, that's the daughter of Mark Antony and the wife of, or former wife, the widow of Drusus, Tiberius's brother, and the mother of Claudius, and of course the mother of Germanicus and others. Tiberius has a letter sent to the Senate which will be read out in Sejanus's presence, and clearly the expectation is that this is the adoption that will mark that final stage of its completion. So, you have, it's carefully managed, but there's also something fairly sadistic about the way this is done. The letter, when it's read out, is actually a condemnation of Sejanus and all that he's done, and you have that, he's very quickly arrested, lynched. The Senate House is being guarded not by Praetorians but by members of the urban cohorts whose commander has already been sounded out about this and whose loyalty is assured. So Macrinus is the man there who makes sure this happens. Sejanus is executed, body thrown into the Tiber, all this sort of thing. His friends, his associate, his family are also executed. And you have the grim business that they dramatise in I Claudius, at least it's done off stage, but nevertheless unpleasant enough of because his boy isn't yet old enough to be a man, his daughter not yet to be a woman, that he's dressed in the toga of manhood and then killed, and she's violated and then killed. There is an interesting difference with these sorts of purges that you get from Tiberius's reign onwards, and it's a development of the Principate that you didn't have in the Republic. That in the Republic you might prescribe someone, you might execute them, but you didn't go after their entire family. You didn't go after the children. You didn't go after the women at all. That starts to change. There's more this sense that you have to wipe out the entire line. So things have got markedly crueler under the emperors. And of course this is an emperor who is terrified, because he suddenly realises the risk he's been in, that this man Sejanus he trusted, his greatest friend, has actually been plotting against him, and the accusations that it was Sejanus who bumped off Drusus and all this sort of thing. So all sorts of terrible stuff has happened, and you've been completely unaware of it until it was almost too late. Because after all, if Sejanus had chosen to, once he was adopted, Tiberius could have been bumped off and Capri, and no one would have been the wiser. So that terror extends into the savagery of the years that follow. Fairly soon after this, the Taciturn account breaks off, so we don't get those last years of Tiberius. The impression is of more Maestas trials. Now it's people associated with Sejanus are some of the main victims. You have, of course, Tacitus gives the account of one senator who's accused of this, saying, well, yeah, of course I went to greet Sejanus every morning. I was, flattered him, did all this sort of thing. Didn't everybody else? I wanted a good career, therefore I went to the man who was a friend, a favourite of the emperor. Again, it comes back to that dilemma that Tacitus has some sympathy towards. He doesn't expect every senator to be a martyr in bad times, but he does think they have to be very careful about their judgment. They can't become active, involved in bumping off other people in treason trials and all this sort of thing. They've got to try and steer this middle path of decent behaviour whilst not getting themselves killed. So we don't know too much about the final years of Tiberius's reign, and you have the rumours again, which of course comes back to the Claudius stuff, that he is thought to have died, hasn't, and then gets smothered for the benefit of Gaius Caligula. Caligula succeeds in 37, and as I mentioned at the start, we don't have Tacitus' narrative for his reign at all, and really for the years either side. So we rely very much on Dio, who's much later, and Suetonius, who tends towards the bizarre. Now, there probably was plenty of bizarre in Caligula's reign, but, when you have the story in Suetonius of him sacrificing a flamingo and this sort of thing, it's very, very strange. This is not normal behaviour. So it's hard to know how much of this is truth and how much is exaggerated. It's always that great problem, because we know from human history that there are these ridiculous stories. When you look at, say, 17th century pamphlets during the English Civil War, this sort of thing, political propaganda at various times that comes out. Sometimes it's so obvious because we know that's not true and this is ridiculous, but there have also been, it's they're marking various liberations of some of the Belsen and some of the other camps involved in the Holocaust at the moment. If you only had fragmentary sources in 1,000 years' time, you might have great difficulty knowing what was the truth in this, because something like that is so appalling that deep down no human being wants to believe that human beings can do that to each other, and yet the facts are there. This is what happened. So it's always very difficult when you come to the past to know about these acts, and there have been monsters, genuinely so, and on balance you tend to feel that Gaius Caligula leaned in that direction, at the very least, but the story making his horse Incitatus a senator, not a consul, as is always, that's what people say. The talk of that perhaps, but it didn't happen. And how do you see that as well? Do you see that as a man who's completely barking mad and thinks his horse is, wonderful and can talk and all this sort of thing and should be there, or somebody who has a pretty nasty sense of humour but wants to show his contempt by the Senate for the Senate by saying, well, look, somebody like this with 4 legs and who can't talk can be just as sensible as the rest of you? Very hard to know, his ideas of dressing up as gods and goddesses and all this sort of stuff. So it's all pretty odd. You have the story of the expedition to Germany and supposedly buying up slaves and dressing them up to look like Germans and giving them blonde wigs and all this sort of thing so they could march in your triumph. Or going to the next planned expedition to Britain, you go to the seashore and you tell the men to... There have been various interpretations. Rather than go and collect seashells to have the spoils of Neptune and triumph over the sea, which comes to it's like stories of Xerxes having the Sea of the Dardanelles whipped because the storm has broken his bridge. There are these weird symbols that you get sometimes in the ancient world. There's also the story that, well, this man's an idiot and a dangerous idiot, so let's just invent something about him. That's the sort of thing he would have done. The problem with stories like that is that they are so good to tell that we naturally repeat them. We don't quite know what was going on. If we had Tacitus, we might have a better chance. But because we don't have that detailed narrative, we do know that princes who'd been thrown out of their own tribal kingdoms back over in Britain had come across and were asking for aid, as they had done to Augustus, as they had done to Tiberius, and as they would do to Claudius, which actually prompted the invasion. Is this something that's actually been settled to Rome's satisfaction by diplomacy anyway, or they've just decided, like the other emperors, that no, it's not worth, there's not enough in it for us to go and strike at Britain. We'll look at Britain and its relationship with the Roman Empire before and then particularly after the conquest in a future lecture. It's just hard to know, and a few things are clear. One is that there was absolutely massive spending which drains the treasury. Caligula likes his big spectacles, and he spends in a way. Tiberius had been quite miserly in terms of public entertainments, partly because he wasn't in Rome, but was seen as a little bit stingy. Caligula goes the other way. We have to remember is that he is also the first emperor to come to the throne with no governmental experience whatsoever. So, Augustus has had this long slog now as fighting a civil war and as a warlord, but then as a triumvir doing all of these things. He's had to learn, and even then he's had that little glimpse of it before Caesar's assassination of how the state actually works, the old republic, at least in theory. Tiberius has slogged on Augustus' behalf as a soldier, as an administrator, before he becomes emperor. Caligula has done nothing. He's not had that experience at all. So not only is he fairly young, he doesn't really know what he's doing, and it's a lot. You are someone now that they've learned from Sejanus experience that if you flatter the emperor and the emperor likes you, then, you know, the sky's the limit pretty much. So you are now in a position where everyone's telling you you're wonderful, where, you know, you declare there won't be any maestas trials, but within a few years there are. People welcome you when you come into Rome, but they're strangers to you. You don't know them because you've been living in Capri the last few years. You don't have any experience. Most of your family is dead or exiled. You know life is dangerous. You then have this illness relatively early on in his reign where his life is feared for, but he does eventually recover and then realizes, perhaps to his horror, that actually the empire's gone on perfectly well without him. So, you know, are you superfluous? Do you really need to be there? Do you need to make it clear? So there's the story of Philo, who is from the Jewish community in Alexandria, is sent as an embassy to see the emperor in Rome. They're finally, after waiting, ushered into his presence, and as soon as they start speaking, Caligula jumps up, runs into another room, so they have to dash after him, follow him. They're chasing him around the palace. Now, again, you could see this as somebody who's an overgrown kid just playing tricks because he can poke people in the eye and know they've got to say, oh, thank you very much, master, you know, this sort of thing. You're the emperor, you can do what you like, no one's going to tell you no. You could, if you wanted to rationalise things, argue, well, actually what he's making them do is get to the damn point. So they realise that they've got to say what they want quickly because he's not going to listen to an hour-long speech with all sorts of florid digressions. So you can see him in various ways, but as I say, he does seem to spend an awful lot more money and doesn't balance the budget in that respect. You know, the treasury is under huge pressure and is probably threatened with running out of funds. The second thing is that only 4 years into his reign he gets murdered, and he's the first emperor to be murdered in this way, and he's one of the few who isn't murdered in a palace conspiracy. There is an officer of the Praetorian Guards involved, but also there are some senators involved in this, and it's rare for them to get that organised to succeed. So, you know, a tribune of the guards involved, but there are lots of executions of senators and equestrians in his reign, and it seems to pick off just, you know, within a year or so, it's back to the bad old days of the worst of Tiberius's reign. So again, he's not going to get a good write-up in the sources because he kills lots of the elite, but also it's very hard to see how you could give him a very good write-up. He clearly annoys enough people to get murdered after such a short time. You know, when you think Nero lasts a lot longer, Commodus lasts a lot longer, unpopular emperors can keep going, and now maybe they're just more careful, but you know, you have the story of he's been going in this, you know, they intercept him in this underground chamber that you can go in, what's probably the one today, or, well, sometimes it's open, sometimes it's not. I've been in there for filming. From the palace, and he was going to see a presentation of some dancers, and, you know, the youth dancers that had come to honour the emperor. He does get murdered. He's succeeded by Claudius. Claudius is discovered by the Praetorian Guard hiding behind a curtain in the palace because the emperor's just murdered, and, you know, everybody knows what's happened with Sejanus and others. They're not expecting this to be a peaceful transition of power. If they've killed the emperor, they're going to kill the entire imperial family. Now, the Senate convenes once the news comes out that Caligula is dead, and for a couple of hours they actually debate a restoration of the traditional republic. I mean, again, republic for the Romans doesn't mean what it means for us. It is not a system of government. It is the res publica, the public thing, the commonwealth. But they actually talk for a while about, let's just go back to having the two consuls as the main executive officers of the state, elected every year, other magistrates in that way. We'll control the armed forces, we'll control everything, we'll pass law. Whether they're going to go back to, let's have the people gathering as an assembly to approve laws and all this sort of thing, or whether this is, for the extent it's discussed, the Senate saying, we've got now new powers under the emperors, we can now pass laws, our decrees count as law in a way they didn't under the traditional republic. So perhaps we should do that. That would be nice, wouldn't it? We'd be in charge, we could do everything. However, very, very quickly, within a matter of hours, they fall out of love with this idea and decide that actually what we really need to do is just appoint one of us, the best of us, to be emperor. We do need an emperor. They're coming to the conclusion that the Strabo argument of early on, that actually we have this empire, it's so big now, we need one man in charge. That's the only way it's going to work, the only way it's going to be stable. However, whilst they're starting to look around themselves and say, oh yeah, okay, so, maybe it could be me, maybe it could be him, this idea, the sense of capax imperi, someone who's worthy of the highest office, worthy of being emperor, it's a concept that we get mentioned by Augustus and others and continues through. And there were several, alternatives to Tiberius, in a sense, that if he didn't want to do the job. However, while all this is going on, an envoy arrives from Claudius, who's been proclaimed emperor by the imperial guard. That envoy is Herod Agrippa, and for that reason we get quite a detailed account of this in Josephus' Jewish Antiquities, which is interesting. So you get this sense of this back and forth and the debate, where eventually Agrippa persuades them, look, whatever you think, yes, you have the prestige of being the Senate, but he's got 9 cohorts of Praetorian guardsmen behind him, so best part of a legion of troops here on the spot. How are you going to stop those? They are loyal to him. After all, from the point of view of the Praetorian Guard, you get paid more than legionaries, you have this cushy posting in Rome where there's not very much danger other than the occasional riot, that sort of thing, but you're not going to go off and have to fight lots of pretty savage-looking barbarians every year in the way that the frontier legions might be doing. And you get all this prestige, you don't have to serve as long. Generally, it's a very good deal. However, to be the Praetorian Guard, we need someone to protect. We need an emperor, therefore, it doesn't matter who that emperor is to some extent, as long as he pays us and treats us well. So Claudius promises a bounty to the Praetorian Guard. Tiberius had done this on accession. Augustus had at various stages in his reign given out gifts, sort of extra bonuses, basically, to the army. Praetorians, from the beginning, get more than your ordinary legionaries, and the same with the officers of all units get more than ordinary soldiers, and it sort of increases proportionally. So an officer of the Praetorian Guard is going to be doing very well indeed. Claudius confirms every emperor does this. It becomes a natural thing to the point where it's expected, and there's a fairly steady inflation that you need to give more each time, just to show how much you value your wonderful bodyguard soldiers. Eventually, the Senate accepts Claudius because they don't have a lot of choice. He's popular with the army because of the association with Germanicus, but Claudius himself hasn't really had a public career. Some minor involvement under Caligula, but nothing else. Now, because we have Suetonius, we get these interesting snippets from private letters, correspondence between Augustus and Livia, talking about the young Claudius. I mean, obviously it's hard not to think of him as the Robert Graves version, and particularly the Derek Jacobi incarnation. But you do have, for instance, this letter from Augustus to Livia, just an extract, and where they're talking about, is Claudius capable of serving a public role, of being seen in public with the family and not embarrassing us, or is he too mentally or physically impaired, or both, to perform this role without being a liability, without being an embarrassment? Therefore, we'll look after him, we'll be nice to him, but we'll keep him out of public sight. And Augustus wrote, as you suggested, I have now discussed with Tiberius what we should do about your grandson Claudius at the coming Games of Mars. We both agree that the decision ought to be taken once and for all. The question is whether he has, shall I say, full command of his senses. And you get a later extract where Augustus said, I spent some time with the lad, and actually, he's brighter than you think. So you have these different versions. Claudius he limps, he drools, he twitches. He is not the dashing figure, the ideal emperor of the prima porta statue of Augustus. However, you wouldn't know from his statues, his busts from his reign, that Claudius was anything other than physically fit. So you get this idealized version. In the end, it was obviously decided that, well, we wouldn't push it too far, we wouldn't send him off to command an army or anything like that, but, we don't have to hide him all the time. But it does mean that he has no military record whatsoever. Same was true of Gaius, of Caligula, who then does go off and, whatever you think of them, mounts these expeditions beyond the Rhine, prepares for an expedition to Britain, whatever it might be. Yes, they're perceived as a sham, but nevertheless he clearly felt some sense of obligation. I need to prove that I am a good soldier. I am a successful commander, because that's what the Roman state needs. That's what the empire needs. He's popular with the army. He, on the whole, seems to rule the empire reasonably well. It's harder to tell what's happening under Caligula. You have, for instance, the provocation where he wants his image put up in the temple in Jerusalem. This prompts what's quite impressive, because you don't get this too often in the ancient world, a peaceful protest. The governor of Syria is given this task to do it, and he's confronted by a very large crowd, representative from the local population, who say, look, as Jews, we simply cannot accept this, and we are willing to die rather than have this, but we're not willing to kill, we're not rebelling, we're not opposing Rome, we are loyal to Rome, and all these things. However, this is just something we cannot accept. It violates the basics of our religion. To his great credit, that Roman legatus was impressed and actually said, well, I'm not going to massacre a crowd of peaceful protesters. I'm going to write back to the emperor. Now, this emperor is Caligula, and this could not be a pretty dicey career move. You could well end up dead, and saying, please think about this again, because it really is a big matter for them, and I don't know whether you necessarily appreciate how insulting, how damaging this is to them, and are we causing trouble for no good reason, because otherwise the province is settled. Fortunately for him, fortunately for everybody involved, Caligula dies, and it's one of those cases where the letter from Claudius telling the governor, yes, you've done exactly the right thing, forget about this, dumb idea, they're good people, just let them get on with it. That letter arrives before the letter from Caligula saying, ordering his execution, and going on with it. So Caligula does clearly do some pretty dumb stuff. And that's one of the cases, but we don't know enough about what's going on in other provinces to judge this too clearly. There do seem to be some chopping and changing in terms of appointment of allied client kings, dynasts, call them what you will, under Caligula, but to some extent continues under Claudius. It's always difficult to judge who's going to be most successful, both reliable to Rome but also capable of controlling and keeping the peace within an area and exploiting it to the extent that you need it exploited for resources. Claudius, generally speaking, though, it seems to go well. He adds these nobles from Gaul to the Senate. Again, we've talked about that with the Tacitian speech. He invades Britain, he gets his glory that way. He does that within less than 2 years of succeeding to the throne. You have the expedition to Britain, which again we'll talk about much more when we talk about Roman Britain. Claudius bothers to travel and is there at Canulodonum when the collapse and surrender of the main confederation, the Cacciaviloni Trinomantes in the southeast. Canulodonum just outside modern Colchester. Colonies established there. There'll be a temple to Claudius, the divine Claudius there, all this sort of thing. Emperors start getting divine honours in the provinces before they die, but there is still that perception that a decent man does not want to be a god during his lifetime, and it's just an honour the Senate votes that you deify an emperor afterwards. This is something we'll touch back on in the future. However, there are big problems with Claudius's wives and with his household. He gets big criticism for his reliance on his household of slaves, but generally freedmen. So this is the time when you get Pallas, Narcissus, people like this. You get Felix, who, a freedman, former slave, becomes the equestrian governor of Judea as procurator. Doesn't get a terribly good press because of that, but he does marry, Berenike. He marries into the Herod family and marries a couple of princesses. So, he's been very, very successful. He could not command a senatorial province. You don't get freedmen cannot serve in the legions in the ranks, let alone as officers. So, although it's sort of this parallel auxiliary career, and when they're commanding any auxiliary troops, that's possible. But it's still, this is a very weird thing, and it's not generally considered a good thing, particularly by not just the Senate, but the broader equestrian class who are freeborn. Son of a freedman, fine, but a freedman himself, there are limits. But Claudius relies on the people he knows and trusts and finds efficient, and they end up, you'll get this in some modern instances where people start, especially the equivalent of using a private email for when you're in public office for official business when you shouldn't, or taking advisors, or to what extent a prime minister or anyone else is influenced by the conversation over the breakfast table with their wife, their children, whatever it might be, their family, their friends. Claudius pushes this too far. Senators should be the people advising the emperor, especially as far as the Senate's concerned. If anybody's doing it, it shouldn't be freemen, and it should also not be your wife. And Claudius has big problems with his wives. He is married to Messalina. There's then the story that, again, we can't go into in too much detail, of her having affair after affair. And then eventually, is it some sort of political coup, or is it just some weird, wine-fueled party where she divorces Claudius, marries somebody else, and seems to be presenting herself as okay, well, this man can now be emperor, this sort of thing. It's very, very strange. It's hard to get to the truth of it. You do get the impression this can't all be black propaganda against her, that something goes seriously wrong, and this is someone who doesn't behave in a sensible political way. And of course it harks back to the Julias under Augustus and this sort of thing, but seems much more extreme than that. Ends up with her execution and those associated with her. He will then marry his niece, Agrippina the Younger. It's the mother of Nero. And rules with her. Both wives, again, they've got far more public in their prominence within the thing. So they're involved in the triumphs. Now, this is, Livia and people like this have done this before, but it's too blatant. And there is this perception. You could even argue that some of the accounts, Suetonius, this sort of thing, it's almost modelled after one of those plays from Plautus or somewhere, where you have the doddering old man with his slave, his freedman, and maybe his wives, or they're running rings around him. It's a farce-like situation. That's how a lot of people present and perceive Claudius and his regime. Because of this, because of all the associations, because of the apparent coup, there are, treason trials start off again, senators get arrested, senators get executed, forced to commit suicide, all this sort of thing. They're often held behind closed doors, which means, like Tiberius on Capri, you can say what you like about what's going on. So Claudius gets this bloodthirsty reputation of, this not very bright man who's just cruel and wants to punish people, wants to convict them, is bitter, is twisted, in part because of all, Messalina and all this sort of thing, but nevertheless. So it's, Claudius goes down. We remember him because of Robert Graves as a good man and a decent chap trying to do his best. The ancient sources are considerably more hostile, which is what Graves was, reacting against, saying, well, you can tell things differently. Claudius has his own son, Britannicus, by Messalina, but he adopts Nero, his stepson. The idea, there was Tiberius Gemellus, the grandson of Tiberius, was supposed to be co-ruler with Caligula, lasts just a few months before he's killed. It's the same with Britannicus, he's bumped off very, very quickly. It seems very hard. A lot of Romans, they seem to have this idea that you could have a college of emperors, two emperors. And Augustus has, of course, demonstrated that you can have one man in charge and lots of very senior assistants. But it doesn't work whenever they try it with anybody else. It nearly always comes down to one is bumped off very quickly. He's a Domitius Ahenobarbus, and the family has a reputation of being unrestrained, wild. There's one in the civil war between Caesar and Pompey who seems guaranteed to do the wrong thing under every occasion. The family has this sort of angry reputation. He's also, of course, descended from Antony, so you've got, on both sides, there's maybe some Romans who'd look at the way they perceive family characteristics and just say, oh, well, what do you expect? He's the youngest emperor so far. He's had no public career whatsoever, no military experience, and he shows no real interest in doing that. Whether or not, again, Claudius had been bumped off, poisoned with mushrooms to ensure that the succession occurs when Britannicus is still too young, Nero is that much older. Nero marries Octavia, Claudius's daughter, but he kills her to marry Poppaea. Sorry, I can never get past, I think it was one of those old comedies from before I was born, the sort of thing they'd replay on radio where they were doing a skit and it was Nero's wife Popeye all the time. Somehow I've never been able to get that out of my head. But anyway, sorry about that. Round the Horn or something like that, I should think. Anyway, initially there is the perception, again, it falls into the pattern that Nero's early reign, okay, is not too bad. He's guided by the senator, the philosopher Seneca, who gets good reputation, but pretty nasty in the way he portrays Claudius, for instance. Does have a checkered career, but nevertheless, because of his death, perhaps becomes, he gets idolized. Generally good government. The provinces seem to be going fairly well. Good men are appointed. Tacitus praises Nero when, in the dispute over Armenia and the confrontation with Parthia, that Nero opts for war rather than a disgraceful peace. So there is this sense that, yeah, okay, he's trying, he's doing the right thing, but that his inner character is not suited to the job, not decent, utterly self-centered, not capable. Both Seneca and Burrus are dispensed with fairly quickly, and they're out the way. Seneca via suicide when he's been condemned. He starts to become stranger in his behaviour, but again he has a long reign. He's there for a long time, and this is a gradual thing that builds up. But you get the theatrical, the musical performances. This sense that what he really wants to do is just have his crowd, have his audience, and sing to them, play the lyre, drive a chariot, do all these things. Fun things for a young aristocrat with more money than brains, but not what an emperor should be doing. You get Tacitian accounts of these sort of burly Praetorian guardsmen keeping the audience in check and making sure everybody stays and applauds at the right moment, and one poor woman forced to give birth because she's not allowed out of the arena, of a senator, people feigning illness, heart attacks, this sort of thing, to try and get out, because we don't really know whether or not he was any good, or whether it was just the fact that he wouldn't stop, he would keep going and loved this adulation. You get the purges of the Senate, you get the, again, Maestas trials, beginning of the reign, we won't do that anymore, and then actually, no, everybody's, I can't trust them, I've got to do this, it's for the good of Rome, they're trying to kill me, all this sort of thing, to the extent where, it's the knock on the door at night and the Praetorian guards turning up to a senator's house and saying, excuse me, sir, is your bathwater warm? Because the approved way of suicide, seen as the most pain-free, was to go into a warm bath and then open your veins on your arm and sort of gradually fall asleep, just sort of gently fade away. And lots of people suffer this fate. There are the informers, there is Tigellinus, the advisor, becomes Praetorian commander, seen as a malign influence. So again, it's this idea that your bad character attracts others with even worse character to you. They influence you because they're brighter than you are, more determined than you are, and you become more and more vicious, cruel, and incompetent. Lots of confiscation of funds. There is again the same spending money like water. So you have the fire in Rome, and a large part of the city centre is devastated. So instead of afterwards, let's put people's houses back up again, Nero constructs the Golden House, which, I don't know, I've never managed to be in Rome when it's actually open to go in and see it. I think it's open again now. Worth it if ever you get a chance. I've obviously studied the reports and the pictures and things, but it's this incredibly lavish, weird palace, basically, for Nero himself. So instead of, what you're replacing the ruins with is something nice for you, but stuff everybody else. Obviously, again, we'll deal with this when we look at religious movements and the Roman state's attitude towards suspect religious groups in the future, and particularly the history of the early Christians and how all that develops, how the state saw them. Nero gets there are rumours blaming him for having started the fire. Now, he probably didn't. The odds are Rome tends to catch light pretty often, and it is a tinderbox. The fire spread very rapidly. Even now you've got the Vigiles, the fire service. Nero is off there, and the story that he plays the lyre and sings of the fall of Troy whilst with this perfect backdrop. Again, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. It's easy to imagine this theatrical youth thinking, well, I can't do anything else, let's seize the opportunity. On the other hand, it's also easy to think, say, well, if you hate Nero, that's just the sort of thing that so-and-so would have done. He does get involved and does seem to organise the controlling the fires, recovering from the fires fairly well, but he's blamed for them, at which point he decides to pick on the Christians as a group of sort of weirdos outside normal society that you can, no one is going to like, so I'll blame them for it, say they were the incendiaries, and that leads to the persecution. But he misplays it. Again, he's one of these things where he pushes the line too hard, people don't believe him, even if they don't like the Christians, they think, well, they're being killed very gruesomely for something they didn't do, and that's not really fair. That's not how the state should work. So you have this, you've got more problems. There's a build, you've got the big rebellion of Boudica in Britain, again, we'll cover in the future, under Nero, and provoked by concerns about finances, treatment of an allied kingdom, and his the heirs to Prasutagus. You'll build up to 66, the big rebellion in Judea, and Josephus presents this as a series of bad governors appointed by a bad emperor. There's also, under Nero, up until then, again we'll look at this in more detail another time, the Roman emperors, Claudius in particular, seem to have been quite favourable to Jewish interests. Partway through Nero's reign that seems to change. Now whether they're actually doing the right thing or not is another matter, but it does, there's probably political misjudgments that lead to all of that. But in the meantime, Nero is setting up the Colossus, which will give the name to the Colosseum, or the nickname, which should be the Flavian Amphitheatre, this gigantic nude statue of himself that has to be moved by a large number of elephants when they actually do construct the Colosseum, because they move it slightly. But it's in that area, and it was later the head would be cut off, it was replaced by that of the sun god. There's something pretty weird about anybody who wants to put up this gigantic statue of themselves in the middle of their city. It is very hard, whereas some people can make the case for Caligula, or at least trying to be a decent emperor some of the time. As the years go on, it's very hard for anybody to make that case about Nero. He tours the East, he goes off and competes in the Olympic Games, is declared the winner, of everything, even in the race when he falls out of his chariot and all this sort of thing, because, who's going to beat the emperor? This is really not a good move. It's all very strange. Yes, he loves the Greek world, and he seems quite popular with certain sections of the population there. These fake Neros that appear, these imposters pretending to be him, in later years gather some supporters. Not enough to make a difference, but some supporters. So there are some people out there who like him, but the Senate and the elite definitely do not, and lots of other people do not either. So you get this, Tigellinus is blamed for a lot of it. Eventually, the Praetorians and the Senate both turn against him. And that prompts Nero to flee and then eventually despair and get his slave to, run him through with a sword. And I've always described that as suicide, and people complain, well, he didn't do it, but he's telling somebody to kill him. I think it's close to that, but okay, fair enough. If you want to be strictly accurate, Nero doesn't strike the blow himself, though he does presumably help drive himself onto it. And supposedly, what an artist perishes in me. The stories of him lying with lead sheets on his chest to try and strengthen his singing voice and his lungs and all this sort of thing. He's clearly taken this quite seriously, but it's very. All the stories about him are very weird. There may be a lot of exaggeration within them. On the other hand, we have Tacitus for at least some of this, so we're on safer ground than we are when we've just got Suetonius and Dio. But so many things occurred behind the scenes in the palace. How he treated Octavia with a really did kick her in the stomach and all this sort of thing. Where it would be, you couldn't really prove. People outside, unless they were actually there at the time, there might be eyewitnesses, but you don't know, nobody else could prove that what they were saying was true or untrue. So that's basically a history of the Julio-Claudians. Let's just sum up a few points about this that we'll come back to as we continue on looking at the later emperors. So, the emperor and the Senate. That's a fundamental part of the relationship. It's part of the emperor's job. It's in particular how the emperor will be judged, will be influenced very strongly by how he has treated this particular group in society. The Senate's gained power. It's not only gained the power to pass laws, it gains the power to elect magistrates under Tiberius. Again, there were some, still formal elections in the old voting assemblies that you had under Augustus, though, again, any candidate that he backed was going to win. But you have those cases where the people elected Augustus consul when he doesn't want to be and he refuses the honour, or elected his grandchildren to office when he didn't want that, when they were too young. There's a degree of independence, but it's limited. That then changes. It's now done within the Senate, so that's good for senators, but it also means the emperor is watching very closely how everybody votes, so it's even harder to go against his opinion. You have the senators still doing well. They're providing the army commanders, the legati. Yes, they don't command the Praetorian Guard, they don't command the smaller equestrian provinces and Egypt, but everywhere else, the bulk of the army are commanded by senatorial legati. Sejanus' father-in-law ends up getting a triumph for campaigning in North Africa as proconsul. In fact, they have because that's the last army until later in Tiberius' reign, when even that is divided off and a legatus takes over a new province which has the legion in, and the proconsul just has a token garrison. But there is also this perception. The empire has been created, the rule of the principate has been created because of civil wars, because senators fought senator for power. These senators who command armies are viewed with some suspicion. They are chosen carefully because they're people that you want to be capable, because you don't want them to, any defeat will be blamed on the emperor. It doesn't have to be there. It's his responsibility for appointing the man. It's his army. They are his legatus, his representative. On the other, and any credit for victory should go to the emperor. You don't want someone who's going to be so spectacularly good that everyone might think they might make a better emperor than you, because there is this perception of the men who are fit to be emperor. You don't want someone to stay too long in a post, campaign too widely, too successfully, that their army becomes more loyal to them than they are to you. On the other hand, Tiberius keeps people in post for much longer than usual. Pontius Pilate, for instance, is in Judea for 10 years. The average seems to be about 3 for most governors. That's not the only example under Tiberius, to the extent where it was resented because people felt the plum jobs weren't being shared around enough. It's partly perhaps lack of energy on Tiberius's part, probably in other respects it's also, well, this chap's there, I trust him, he's doing a decent job, let's not rock the boat, let's not change things. But of course, they can't afford to become too popular, and senators still live closely around the emperor, at least while the emperor's in Rome. Tiberius removes himself from this and creates the problem, and then Sejanus attracts some of the attention that would otherwise have gone to him. Under Claudius, his wives, his freedmen attract similar attention. Anyone who can influence the emperor is seen as important and therefore is courted by everybody, including other senators, even if they don't like these and they're holding their nose because this is not the sort of person who should have influence. Nevertheless, they do. That's the reality. I want that influence employed in my favour. There is, of course, then the threat of assassins. There are the stories in Sejanus of Augustus once or twice going to the Senate wearing a breastplate under his tunic and under his toga, in case somebody tried to stab him like Julius Caesar. This leads to all the maestas trials, accusations of disloyalty, treason, the informers, the prosecutors. It's a good way as someone to start off your career and prove your loyalty to the emperor is by condemning somebody else and saying, oh, look at this, I've got evidence he's plotting against you, or he's expecting you to die, or all this sort of thing. It's always hard to know whether there's any truth in this. Obviously, Caligula does get murdered, so there was a conspiracy then, even though we might feel, it's like the plots against Hitler, well, they've got very good reason to do this. But with the unsuccessful ones, with people who are accused of planning this and then condemned and commit suicide or executed, was there truth in it? I mean, you have the quote from Domitian, repeated by Hadrian later on, do I have to be murdered before you believe that people are plotting against me? In this sense that from the point of view of one of these monarchs, one of these emperors, if the plot is uncovered and you arrest people, then people, there's the tendency to say, well, okay, they made that up, that's just propaganda. So, the only way you can actually prove there was genuinely a plot is to die, which is obviously not a terribly good move as far as your personal story is told. But the point is, bad emperors kill senators in large numbers, and the senators write the histories. Therefore, even if they're able administrators, these people become bad emperors. That's probably true of Claudius. Tiberius to an extent, although clearly the misjudgment with Sejanus was a big one. And Tiberius does fundamentally change the system. His withdrawal from the day-to-day job of being emperor, the day-to-day mixing with senators and others in Rome, causes problems. That's not the way Augustus had done things, because even when he was away, there was somebody in Rome to do this. Tiberius withdraws and doesn't leave anybody to do this job, and Sejanus effectively inherits it or usurps it, however you want to put it. It creates that problem that the system requires access to the emperor. and the emperor to do things and respond to petitions, to problems, to give rulings, to arbitrate when disputes have got this far and nobody else can resolve it. And it works best when you're keeping Rome's elite happy, because Rome's elite are the people through whom you rule. They are the ones who provide your governance. You are more likely to trust them if you know them. They're more likely to trust you. But again, that requires the charm, the affability, and the intelligence of Augustus. Tiberius has the intelligence, but he doesn't have the charm and the affability, and he doesn't have the energy. He just can't be bothered. So he pulls out from a situation he doesn't like, but that then distorts the system. And he doesn't travel around the empire. He doesn't leave... he goes as far as Capri. That's as far away from Italy as he goes as emperor. And most of his successors will follow that pattern. Claudius goes to Britain, but only for a couple of weeks. He tours through Gaul on the way, but he doesn't spend most of his reign touring. Caligula goes a bit, but again spends more of his time in Italy than elsewhere. Nero even more so. The pattern is set that will be broken by people like Trajan and then particularly Hadrian, where the emperor actually stays in Italy, if not in Rome itself. And that's a shift from the Augustan model, and perhaps not a very good one. But it partly reflects the difference that Augustus had lots of family members he could trust to go on his behalf or to stay in Rome and Italy on his behalf. Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero onwards do not have that luxury. So if they're going to trust anybody, it has to be from outside the family, and that poses all sorts of risks. Tiberius does trust Sejanus, and it doesn't go well. The emperors control careers. So the whole question of patronage, ultimately the Roman world, Roman society works on patronage, and the emperor is the ultimate source of this. So he controls the careers of senators, and therefore, again, it comes back to this point, anyone who can influence the emperor, a wife, a freedman, praetorian prefect, whoever it might be, is worth courting because they might be able to direct that influence in your direction. Sejanus took over this system, controlled access to Tiberius, therefore controlled the patronage that the emperor possessed. No one else ever gets as far as that. He fails, as we've seen, and is killed, but that's partly because he lacks the full support of the Senate. They don't like him very much. He isn't one of them. And a lot of them have fallen victim to his rise. So perhaps a senator, though, could do this, which is another reason why it's hard for the emperor to leave Italy without somebody you can trust absolutely there to keep things going, or without the assurance which, after Tiberius, none of his successors have, that everyone's going to trust you. Everybody realizes. Augustus, by the later decade, didn't face any plots. Any problems were going to come from within his own family, but there's not these external conspiracies. With Tiberius, it takes a long time. He inherits that, but because of Sejanus, because of what happens, because of the aftermath of that, that creates a far more nervous climate amongst the elite in Rome than you've had under Augustus. So it contributes to that sense of a more distant emperor, a less affable, a less approachable emperor, and it's it's removing the oil from the machine, really, that made the Principate function quite as well as it did. So there's less oil, more grit from this time on. But again, it reinforces this sense, if the wrong sort of people are influencing the emperor, then senators don't like that. The senators effectively dictate the history, so how you're going to be remembered will be influenced by that. As I say, there is a fair chance that Claudius's freedmen were actually pretty good administrators. And even Felix is presented in a hostile way, but wasn't an absolute disaster, wasn't a monster. You have, even in the book of Acts, there's the implication that Felix keeps Paul in prison because he's expecting just a bribe to let him go. There are plenty of other Roman governors who weren't freedmen who acted in exactly the same way. But he's not given a favourable view, but he's also not the absolute monster. There are worse governors in Josephus' account than Felix, though again, he doesn't come out as one of the good ones. Just briefly before we finish, let's talk about the army, because this is the ultimate basis of the emperor's power. 26 legions, increases to around about 30 by the end of the century. There's probably about 28 in Nero's day. That's so for most of the first century, that's about the typical number. Auxiliaries, Tacitus says the throwaway comment, as many or more, basically. It's roughly the same number of auxiliaries as legionaries. So you're looking at an army that's 300,000 or so strong on paper, plus naval units, plus the Rome cohorts, this sort of thing. A very big army, majority commanded by an imperially appointed legatus, your representative in an imperial province. Oath of loyalty to you, their pay comes from you, their rewards come from you, their promotion comes from you. You simply can't risk anybody becoming too popular with them. So there is the fascinating case where Corbulo, who gets a very good write-up from Tacitus and was the main commander. He'd done well on the Rhine under Claudius, and then he'd taken over it's not really a war against Parthia, but the struggle over Armenia. He'd been both governor of Syria and of the sort of Cappadocian province that had been broken off from it at various times, and the overall theatre commander in that conflict that spreads over the best part of a decade, and had fought it to a successful conclusion based on diplomacy. The King of Armenia, who's the brother of the Parthian King of Kings, agrees to travel to Rome to accept the crown from Nero. So he's recognising that the Romans have to approve him. And whilst this is seen as a concession, because after all he is the brother of the Parthian king, nevertheless that he leaves his kingdom to do this, that he bows before Nero, kneels before Nero. He won't not carry a sword because he's the King of Armenia, but he has it nailed into his scabbard. You can see this, and people often do this as a great victory for the Parthians and Nero backing down, but actually it's within the spirit of Augustan diplomacy, because somebody is submitting to you, and in the long run, nobody is very good at controlling Armenia, including kings of Armenia. So it's a difficult area, but what you've avoided is there is the embarrassing defeat in 62, where a Roman army surrenders before Corbulo's relief army arrives, and there isn't a really big military victory to balance that out. On the other hand, Corbulo is able to march where he wants. There is submission. So again, that's acceptable from the Roman point of view. There don't have to be piles of corpses if the enemy gives in. So he seems to have served Nero very well, but suspicion over his family. He is summoned to Nero on his tour of Greece and basically told to commit suicide. There is a sense, Tacitus has attributed the comment to him when he, in response to raiding by Germanic tribes into his province, he forms an army, he crosses the Rhine and is marching into Germany, setting up camps, establishing garrisons, when a letter arrives from Claudius recalling him, and he's supposed to have said, how happy the generals in the Republic were. Basically in the old days, if I was a Caesar, if I was a Pompey, I could just steam off, win the war to what I felt was its necessary conclusion, win the most glory. I can't do that now, I've got to obey the emperor. But he obeys the emperor. And he's been loyal to Nero all the way through. He has to kill himself because in a sense he's too successful. So there is always this danger, and it comes back to this factor we'll look at when we consider other aspects of the imperial policy, the foreign policy, the conquest. Emperors don't want to leave Italy and Rome, or, if they're like Tiberius, they want to go off and live in Capri, but they're not going abroad, they're not going to the provinces as such. They don't want to be in Rome, but they don't want to be far away either. But most of them do not wish to spend years fighting wars in the provinces. If they trust anybody else to do that, they have to be very careful this person doesn't get ideas above their station and revives that spectre of the civil war. That, of course, returns dramatically after Nero's death, when you have the era 4 emperors with Galba, Otho, Vitellius and Vespasian. We'll talk about that in the future, but this is the first big civil war they've had for a century, and it scares people. It's a reminder of how quickly the empire could be torn apart, and there isn't another one on this scale until death of Commodus, death of Pertinax, and 193. So the Principate is working well enough to control the civil wars that have torn the Republic apart. So in spite of all the criticisms we've made, some of the comments we've talked about of these emperors, the system functions, the system is successful, the empire is generally prosperous in this period, generally stable. There is that capacity for it to break down in the wrong circumstances. Anyway, that's an overview of the Julio-Claudians politically. Obviously, we could have gone into far more detail about each one of them, but those are things we can leave for another day. For the context of this series, The Conquered and the Proud, we're trying to give an overview of 400 years of Roman history. we can't get into too much detail, but there are, so those of you who've read more about individuals will know there are things I haven't covered or others where I've simplified the situation. But as I say, that's all stuff we can look at again in the future. But for the moment, thanks for watching.